Keep in mind that in part one, I am displaying symptoms of covert drugging and the long-term effects of Depakote. And I have been forced to the conclusion that even if there is something wrong with you people, don't take psychiatric medication. Just don't do it. It's not going to help you as much as you think, any more than methamphetamines helps people. They say, well, it helps me get through my day at work. It's not going to help you. I mean, I've suffered so many horrible side effects, at least 10 serious side effects I'm suffering from the medication. And it is on record, the side effects of the medication, and over half of them have nothing to do with mental illness. Because the argument will be made from these unscrupulous knaves that, well, actually, that's just untreated mental illness. No. I'm not going to get into what all of them are. But no. And I'll give you an example. If I was to experience hair loss, and I'm not saying I am or not, what kind of an idiot would say, well, that's because you're not treating your mental illness? And there is the side effects I'm describing, that I'm talking about, are just as obvious as that. On record, I am suffering the long-term effects of psychiatric medication. And I'm not saying it's related, and I'm not saying it's not. But one of my first psychiatrists, and the first official diagnosis that I believe that they have on record, was from a white Jew. From my understanding, an atheist Jew, and certainly by his actions, an atheist Jew. So now let me continue from page 6 and get to page 10 for this part 2, and I'll wrap up the last 6 pages in part 3. So just to be clear, the side effects are in part 1, and they're both before 26 minutes. One is when I look back on the paper and I twitch real quickly. You know, just one quick twitch backwards. You could describe it as a tick, a spasm, a tremor. It's not exactly a seizure where it's shaking, but it's just a quick twitch. Another is something I've noticed in past videos where when I'm talking intensely, my eyes kind of, I guess you could say there's a flicker or something of that nature. These are on record side effects of Depakote, things that I haven't experienced before taking psychiatric medications, not even a single time. Things that don't exactly make me popular with the opposite sex and absolutely feeding to eugenics and make one want to kill themselves when they're forced to the conclusion that there are no cures for these things. There's just more medications, quote unquote, more death pills with more side effects and the resulting depression. Anyway, radioactive iodine experiments. In a 1949 operation called the Green Run, the AEC released iodine-131 and xenon-133 to the atmosphere near the Hanford site in Washington, which contaminated a 500,000-acre area containing 3 small towns. In 1953, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission ran several studies at the University of Iowa on the health effects of radioactive iodine in newborns and pregnant women. In one study, researchers gave pregnant women from 100 to 200 microcuries of iodine-131 in order to study the women's aborted embryos in an attempt to discover at what stage and to what extent radioactive iodine crosses the placental barrier. In another study, they gave 25 newborn babies who were under 36 hours old and weighed from 5.5 to 8.5 pounds iodine-131 either by oral administration or through an injection so that they could measure the amount of iodine in their thyroid glands, as iodine would go to that gland. In another study, another AEC study, researchers at the University of Nebraska College of Medicine fed iodine-131 to 28 healthy infants through a gastric tube to test the concentration of iodine in the infants' thyroid glands. In 1953, the AEC sponsored a study to discover if radioactive iodine affected premature babies differently from full-term babies. In the experiment, researchers from Harper Hospital in Detroit orally administered iodine-131 to 65 premature and full-term infants who weighed from 2.1 to 5.5 pounds. From 1955 to 1960, Sonoma State Hospital in Northern California, which is where they might send me, mind you, That's a more permanent hospital, for people, for political dissidents they set up and for the criminally insane. Anyway, served as a permanent drop-off location for mentally handicapped children diagnosed with cerebral palsy or lesser disorders. The children subsequently underwent painful experimentation without adult consent. Many were given irradiated milk, some spinal taps, for which they received no direct benefit. Reporters of 60 Minutes learned that in these 5 years, the brain of every child with cerebral palsy who died at Sonoma State was removed and studied without parental consent. According to the CBS story, over 1,400 patients died at that clinic. In an experiment in the 1960s, over 100 Alaskan citizens were continually exposed to radioactive iodine. In 1962, the Hanford site again released I-131, stationing test subjects along its path to record its effects on them. The AEC also recruited Hanford volunteers to ingest milk contaminated with I-131 during this time. Uranium experiments. It is desired that no document be released which refers to experiments with humans and might have adverse effect on public opinion or result in legal suits. Documents covering such work should be classified secret. And that's a quote. April 17, 1947, Atomic Energy Commission memo from Colonel O.G. Haywood, Jr., to Dr. Fiedler at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. That's who it was, in case you missed it. These people are scum. They know the public is not going to approve of this. The public's not going to say, well, we need it for national security. They're not stupid. They know you don't need it. They know that that's all a front, and that's how you justify your funding. Anyway, between 1946 and 1947, researchers at the University of Rochester injected uranium-234 and uranium-235 in dosages ranging from 6.4 to 70.7 micrograms per kilogram of body weight into 6 people to study how much uranium their kidneys could tolerate before becoming damaged. I don't think I need to explain how sick that is. Between 1953 and 1957 at the Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. William, and I apologize if I'm reading fast, but I know people's attention spans and so on. There's a lot to cover. Dr. William Sweet injected 11 terminally ill, comatose and semi-comatose patients with uranium in an experiment to determine, among other things, its viability as a chemotherapy treatment against brain tumors, which all but one of the patients had, one being a misdiagnosis. Dr. Sweet, who died in 2001, maintained that consent had been attained from the patients and next of kin. From April 10, 1945 to July 18, 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium as part of the Manhattan Project, a real-life project. Doses administered ranged from 95 to 5,900 nanocuries. Now, when you look at the Manhattan Project, they'll talk about transporting ships and aliens and all kinds of stuff to distract you from what really happened. They do a lot to distract you from these non-consensual experimentations because they lead you to Masonry and the very philosophies that created this secularist country and that allow for these things to continue. Albert Stevens, a man, which is the philosophy of science, quote unquote. Albert Stevens, a man misdiagnosed with stomach cancer, received treatment for his cancer at the UC San Francisco Medical Center in 1945. Dr. Joseph Gilbert Hamilton, a Manhattan Project doctor in charge of the human experiments in California, had Stevens injected with Pu-238 and Pu-239 without informed consent. Stevens never had cancer. A surgery to remove cancerous cells was highly successful in removing the benign tumor, and he lived for another 20 years with the injected plutonium. Since Stevens received the highly radioactive Pu-238, his accumulated dose over his remaining life was higher than anyone has ever received. 64 SV. Neither Albert Stevens nor any of his relatives were told that he had cancer. They were led to believe that the experimental treatment had worked. His cremated remains were surreptitiously, secretly in other words, acquired by Argonne National Laboratory Center for Human Radiobiology in 1975 without the consent of surviving relatives. Some of the ashes were transferred to the National Human Radiobiology Tissue Repository in Washington State University, which keeps the remains of people who died having radioisotopes in their body. 3 patients at Billings Hospital at the University of Chicago were injected with plutonium. In 1946, 6 employees of a Chicago metallurgical lab were given water that was contaminated with plutonium-239 so that researchers could study how plutonium is absorbed into the digestive tract. An 18-year-old woman at an upstate New York hospital expecting to be treated for a pituitary gland disorder was injected with plutonium. Experiments involving other radioactive materials. Immediately after World War II, researchers at Vanderbilt University gave 829 pregnant mothers in Tennessee what they were told were vitamin drinks that would improve the health of their babies. The mixtures contained radioactive iron, and the researchers were determining how fast the radioisotopes crossed into the placenta. At least 3 children are known to have died from the experiments, from cancers to leukemia. 4 of the women's babies died from cancers as a result of the experiments, and the women experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, hair, tooth loss, and cancer. From 1946 to 1953, at the Walter E. Fernald State School in Massachusetts, in an experiment sponsored by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and the Quaker Oats Corporation, 73 mentally disabled children were fed oatmeal containing radioactive calcium and other radioisotopes in order to track how nutrients were digested. The children were not told that they were being fed radioactive chemicals. They were told by hospital staff and researchers that they were joining a science club. You know, you gotta love how these people do this stuff under the guise of science and that they're the experts. Anyway, the University of California Hospital in San Francisco exposed 29 patients with some rheumatoid arthritis to total body irradiation to obtain data for the military. In the 1950s, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia performed experiments on severe burn victims, most of them poor and black, without their knowledge or consent, with funding from the Army and in collaboration with the AEC. In the experiments, the subjects were exposed to additional burning, experimental antibiotic treatment, and injections of radioactive isotopes. The amount of radioactive phosphorus-32 injected into some of the patients, 500 microcuries, was 50 times the acceptable dose for a healthy individual for people with severe burns. This likely led to significantly increased death rates. Between 1948 and 1955, funded by the federal government, researchers at the Johns Hopkins Hospital inserted radium rods into the noses of 582 Baltimore, Maryland school children as an alternative to adenylectomy. Similar experiments were performed on over 7,000 U.S. Army and Navy personnel during World War II. Nasal radium irradiation became a standard medical treatment and was used in over 2.5 million Americans. In another study at the Walter E. Fernald State School in 1956, researchers gave mentally disabled children radioactive calcium orally and intravenously. They also injected radioactive chemicals into malnourished babies and then pushed needles through their skulls into their brains, through their necks, and into their spines to collect cerebrospinal fluid for analysis. In 1961 and 1962, 10 Utah State Prison inmates had blood samples taken which were mixed with radioactive chemicals and re-injected back into their bodies. The Atomic Energy Commission funded the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to administer radium-224 and thorium-234 to 20 people between 1961 and 1965. Many were chosen from the Age Center of New England and had volunteered for research projects on aging. Doses were 0.2 to 2.4 microcuries for radium and 1.2 to 120 microcuries for thorium. In a 1967 study that was published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, pregnant women were injected with radioactive cortisol to see if it would cross the placental barrier and affect the fetuses. Fallout research covered the final report of Project 4.1, which examined the effects of radioactive fallout on the natives of the Marshall Islands in 1957. Atmospheric nuclear explosions in Nevada, which were part of Operation Plum Bob, were later determined to have released enough radiation to have caused from 11,000 to 212,000 excess cases of thyroid cancer among U.S. citizens who were exposed to fallout from the explosions, leading to between 1,100 and 21,000 deaths. I remember we touched on that in school, in college. I believe that those were the islands explosions they were talking about that people don't talk about. And these were part of the non-consensual experimentations. Now, for those of you who are stupid enough to say, what does this have to do with eugenics? Look, they're picking on the vulnerable and the less educated members of society, whether they are babies and never had a chance to be educated, or whether they are poor or inmates, okay? This follows a eugenics philosophy exactly, and is taking place during a period of time where eugenicist-friendly presidents were in office, such as the Roosevelts and Truman. Early in the Cold War, in studies known as Project Gabriel and Project Sunshine, researchers in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia tried to determine how much nuclear fallout would be required to make the Earth uninhabitable. They realized that atmospheric nuclear testing had provided them an opportunity to investigate this. Such tests had dispersed radioactive contamination worldwide. An examination of human bodies could reveal how readily it was taken up and hence how much damage it caused. Of particular interest was strontium-90 in the bones. Infants were the primary focus as they would have had a full opportunity to absorb the new contaminants. As a result of this conclusion, researchers began a program to collect human bodies and bones from all over the world with a particular focus on infants. The bones were cremated and the ashes analyzed for radioisotopes. This project was kept secret primarily because it would be a public relations disaster. As a result, parents and family were not told what was being done with the body parts of their relatives. This goes back to eugenics and all its applications and why it's being done covertly now. Irradiation experiments. Between 1960 and 1971, the Department of Defense funded non-consensual whole-body radiation experiments on poor black cancer patients who were not told what was being done to them. Patients were told that they were receiving a treatment that might cure their cancer, but the Pentagon was trying to determine the effects of high levels of radiation on the human body. One of the doctors involved in the experiments, Robert Stone, was worried about litigation by the patients. He referred to them only by their initials on the medical reports. He did this so that, in his words, there will be no means by which the patients can ever connect themselves up with the report, in order to prevent either adverse publicity or litigation. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Sanger, different from Margaret Sanger, mind you, spelling at least, funded by the Defense Atomic Support Agency, performed whole-body radiation experiments on more than 90 poor, black, terminally ill cancer patients with inoperable tumors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. He forged consent forms and did not inform the patients of the risks of irradiation. The patients were given 100 or more rads. Remember, he forged the consent forms. Goes back to what they may have done with me, 100 or more rads of whole body radiation, which in many caused intense pain and vomiting. Critics have questioned the medical rationale for this study and contend that the main purpose of the research was to study the acute effects of radiation exposure. From 1963 to 1973, a leading endocrinologist, Dr. Carl Heller, irradiated the testicles of Oregon and Washington prisoners. Too bad it wasn't principals. I know, bad joke. Anyway, in return for their participation, he gave them $5 a month and $100 when they had to receive a vasectomy upon conclusion of the trial. The surgeon was sterilized. The men said that it was necessary to keep them from contaminating the general population with radiation-induced mutants. So there you have a sterilization, right? They said, look, you people have a genetic, not even a genetic, a health abnormality. You are glowing motherfuckers, basically. Your nuts are glowing. And we don't want you to create a bunch of radiation-induced mutants, so we're going to sterilize you. So absolutely, I've just definitively connected this with the eugenics rationale, period. And remember, this is 1963 to 1973, and the last compulsory sterilization was in 1981, I believe, in Oregon. Dr. Joseph Hamilton, one of the researchers who had worked with Heller on the experiments, said that the experiments had a little of the Buchenwald touch. That was a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. In 1963, University of Washington researchers irradiated the testes of 232 prisoners to determine the effects of radiation on testicular function. When these inmates later left the prison and had children, at least 4 of them had offspring born with birth defects. The exact number is unknown because researchers have never followed up on the status of the subjects. Now, keep in mind, this is reminiscent, or rather what happened recently is reminiscent of this. Okay, in 2015, Nashville prosecutors coerced people into sterilizations as part of plea agreements. 2006 to 2010, 160, I believe, female inmates were, sterilized, pretty much against their will. Okay? This definitively proves that these non-consensual experimentations, the sterilizations, and the eugenics has continued. And it's going on right now while these people have their panties in the bunch as they watch me prove this definitively in a way that forces even the most arrogant, ignorant, out-of-touch, bootlicking retards to concede my point. Chemical experiments. Non-consensual tests. From 1942 to 1944, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service conducted experiments which exposed thousands of U.S. military personnel to mustard gas in order to test the effectiveness of gas masks and protective clothing. From 1950 through 1953, the U.S. Army sprayed chemicals over 6 cities in the United States and Canada in order to test dispersal patterns of chemical weapons. Kind of reminds you of chemtrails, right? Don't know whether chemtrails are real or not. I suspect they are. Army records stated that the chemicals which were sprayed on the city of Winnipeg, Canada, included zinc, cadmium sulfide, which was not thought to be harmful. A 1997 study by the U.S. National Research Council found that it was sprayed at levels so low as not to be harmful. It is said that people were normally exposed to higher levels in urban environments. To test whether or not sulfuric acid, which is used in making molasses, was harmful as a food additive, I didn't leave that one alone. The Louisiana State Board of Health commissioned a study to feed Negro prisoners nothing but molasses for 5 weeks. One report stated that prisoners didn't object to submitting themselves to the test because it would not do any good if they did. Lowly, these people are sniveling racists. These same racist dogs are experimenting on me right now. And Lord knows they deserve to die for it. And I'm not saying I'm going to kill them, but Lord knows they deserve to die for it. A 1953 article in which a 1950 article in the Medical Scientific Journal, Clinical Science, described a medical experiment in which researchers intentionally blistered the skin on the abdomens of 41 children who ranged in age from 8 to 14 using cantharide. The study was performed to determine how severely the substance injuries irritates the skin of children. After the studies, the children's blister skin was removed with scissors and swabbed with peroxide. That's disgusting. All right. We're almost done with part 2. So, hopefully you're interested and you're disgusted as I am. If you're not, you're a coward. You're a fool. If you're like, who cares about history? You're a dumbass. Look, motherfucker. Your kids are going to be experimented on by godless scum. Anyway. Had to get that off my system. Out of my system, I apologize. Operation Top Hat. In June 1953, the United States Army formally adopted guidelines regarding the use of human subjects in chemical, biological, and radiological testing and research, where authorization from the Secretary of the Army was now required for all research projects involving human subjects. Under the guidelines, 7 research projects involving chemical weapons and human subjects were submitted by the Chemical Corps for the Secretary of the Army approval in August 1953. 1 project involved vesicants, 1 involved phosgene, and 5 were experiments which involved nerve agents. All 7 were approved. The guidelines, however, left a loophole. They did not define what types of experiments and tests required such approval from the Secretary. Operation Top Hat was among the numerous projects not submitted for approval. It was termed a local field exercise by the Army and took place from September 15th to 19th, 1953 at the Army Chemical School at Fort McClellan, Alabama. The experiments used Chemical Corps personnel to test decontamination methods for biological and chemical weapons, including sulfur, mustard, and nerve agents. The personnel were deliberately exposed to these contaminants, which were not volunteers and were not informed of the tests. In a 1975 Pentagon Inspector General's report, the military maintained that Operation Top Hat was not subject to the guidelines requiring approval because it was a line of duty exercise in the Chemical Corps. Holmesburg Program. Chloracne, resulting from exposure to dioxins, such as those that Albert Kligman injected into prisoners at the Holmesburg prison from approximately 1951 to 1974. The Holmesburg prison in Pennsylvania was the site of extensive dermatological research operations using prisoners as subjects led by Dr. Albert M. Kligman of the University of Pennsylvania. The studies were performed on behalf of Dow Chemical Company, the U.S. Army, and Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson, the same company that spent almost pretty much a record amount on marketing. I believe they spent like $14.2 billion on marketing in 1 year. Anyway, talk about mind control, right? In one of the studies for which Dow Chemical paid Kligman $10,000, Kligman injected dioxin, a highly toxic carcinogenic compound found in Agent Orange, which Dow was manufacturing for use in Vietnam at the time, into 70 prisoners, most of them black. The prisoners developed severe lesions which went untreated for 7 months. Dow Chemical wanted to study the health effects of dioxin and other herbicides and how they affect human skin because workers at their chemical plants were developing chloracne. In the study, Kligman applied roughly the same amount of dioxin as that to which Dow employees were being exposed in 1980 and 1981. You know, this last 1981, remember, the last year of the sterilizations on record, you know, of course, until later on, the recent ones. Some of the people who were used in this study sued Professor Kligman for a variety of health problems, including lupus and psychological damage. You know, let's just finish this part. I'll be halfway down to page 11 for part 3. Anyway. Kligman later continued his dioxin studies, increasing the dosage of dioxin he applied to the skin of 10 prisoners to 7,500 micrograms of dioxin, which is 468 times the dosage that the Dow Chemical official Gerald K. Rowe had authorized him to administer. As a result, the prisoners developed inflammatory pustules and papules. The Holmesburg program paid hundreds of inmates a nominal stipend to test a wide range of cosmetic products and chemical compounds, whose health effects were unknown at the time. Upon his arrival at Holmesburg, Kligman is claimed to have said, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." A 1964 issue of Medical News reported that 9 out of 10 prisoners at Holmesburg prison were medical test subjects. In 1967, the U.S. Army paid Kligman to apply skin blistering chemicals to the faces and backs of inmates at Holmesburg. In Kligman's words, to learn how the skin protects itself against chronic assault from toxic chemicals, the so-called hardening process. Okay, I would like to end this part 2 by exploring the connections. Okay, we've seen a lot of inmates. We've seen disproportionately black prisoners. You know, the ones in Vietnam, there were 70 prisoners, most of them black, right? Oh, excuse me. You know, it was for which Dow was manufacturing for use in Vietnam at the time, into 70 prisoners. Okay, most of them black. And they didn't sue till the 1980s. So 1951 to 1974, this was taking place. Remember, this is after the 60s and all this stuff, right? I was born in the early 80s. This is like 6 years. You know, this ended about 6, 7, 8 years before I was born. Can't tell you, you know, which one for, you know, because it's too much information. Anyway, the point is, this is a disgrace, people. This is an absolute disgrace. These people, you know, it's the eugenics attitude. This is part of eugenic legislation and covert eugenics operations, whether you want to admit it or not. There's the on-record sterilizations, and then there's the covert operations, which was a result of eugenic philosophies that came straight from a Freemason, you know, Francis Galton, who Freemasons never officially, you know, kicked out. They never said, you know what, we officially, you know, expel him, excommunicate him, whatever you want to call it. They never did that. They never turned around and said, we are ashamed of this guy. They never turned around and said, we're ashamed of Roosevelt or Truman. These eugenicist dogs that started the OSS and CIA and all the horrible things that have happened since. No, they are proud to be racist whites with their international Jewish financier friends. Psychological and torture experiments. Notice they're in the same category. U.S. government research. The United States government funded and performed numerous psychological experiments, especially during the Cold War era. Many of these experiments were performed to help develop more effective torture and interrogation techniques for the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, and to develop techniques for Americans to resist torture at the hands of enemy nations and organizations. Truth serum. In studies running from 1947 to 1953, which were known as Project Chatter, the U.S. Navy began identifying and testing truth serums, which they hoped could be used during interrogations of Soviet spies. Some of the chemicals tested on human subjects included mescaline and the anti-cholinergic drug scopolamine. Shortly thereafter, in 1950, the CIA initiated Project Bluebird, later renamed Project Artichoke, whose stated purpose was to develop the means to control individuals through special interrogation techniques. Ways to prevent the extraction of information from CIA agents and offensive uses of unconventional techniques such as hypnosis and drugs. The purpose of the project was outlined in a memo dated January 1952 that stated, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation?" The project studied the use of hypnosis, forced morphine addiction, and subsequent forced withdrawal, and the use of other chemicals among other methods to produce amnesia and other vulnerable states in subjects. In order to perfect techniques for the abstraction of information from individuals, whether willing or not, Project Bluebird researchers experimented with a wide variety of psychoactive substances, including LSD, heroin, marijuana, cocaine, PCP, mescaline, and ether. Project Bluebird researchers dosed over 7,000 U.S. military personnel with LSD without their knowledge or consent at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Years after these experiments, more than 1,000 of these soldiers suffered from severe illnesses, including depression, epilepsy, and epilepsy. Many of them tried to commit suicide. Now, keep in mind that these techniques have been used by the LAPD and other organizations, and it does seem that either secret societies or white hate groups transferred their transferable skills of, unethical interrogation techniques to law enforcement, because they get gang members addicted to heroin, and they try to scare them by driving them through enemy neighborhoods and saying they're going to drop them off while they're drugged, and things of this nature. Anyway, drug deaths. In 1952, professional tennis player Harold Bloor died when injected by Dr. James Cattle with a fatal dose of a mescaline derivative at the New York State Psychiatric Institute of Columbia University. The United States Department of Defense, which sponsored the injection, worked in collusion with the Department of Justice and the New York State Attorney General to conceal evidence of its involvement for 23 years. Cattle claimed that he did not know what the Army had given him to inject into Bloor, saying, "We didn't know whether it was dog piss or what we were giving him." On November 19, 1953, Dr. Frank Olson was without his knowledge or consent given an LSD dosage before his death 9 days later. For 22 years, this was covered up until the Project MKUltra revelations. MKUltra. In 1953, the CIA placed several of its interrogation and mind control programs under the direction of a single program, known by the code name MKUltra, after CIA Director Alan Dulles complained about not having enough human guinea pigs to try these extraordinary techniques. The MKUltra project was under the direct command of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb of the Technical Services Division. The project received over $25 million and involved hundreds of experiments on human subjects at 80 different institutions. In a memo describing the purpose of one MKUltra subprogram, Richard Helms said, "We intend to investigate the development of a chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, the specific nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, and implanting suggestions and other forms of mental control." In 1954, the CIA's Project QK Hilltop was created to study Chinese brainwashing techniques and to develop effective methods of interrogation. Most of the early studies are believed to have been performed by the Cornell University's Medical School's Human Ecology Study programs under the direction of Dr. Harold Wolff. Wolff suggested that the CIA provide him any information they could find regarding threats, coercion, imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, black psychiatry, and hypnosis, or any combination of these, with or without chemical agents. According to Wolff, the research team would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate this information, and will then undertake experimental investigations designed to develop new techniques of offensive defensive intelligence use. Potentially useful secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures will be similarly tested in order to ascertain the fundamental effect upon human brain function and upon the subject's mood. Where any of the studies involve potential harm of the subject, we expect the agency to make available suitable subjects and a proper place for the performance of the necessary experiments. Dr. Harold Wolff, Cornell University Medical School. It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and bidding of the all-highest? George Hunter White, who oversaw drug experiments for the CIA as part of Operation Midnight Climax. Another of the MKUltra subprojects, Operation Midnight Climax, consisted of a web of CIA-run safe houses in San Francisco, Marin, and New York, which were established in order to study the effects of LSD on unconsenting individuals. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure clients back to the safe houses, where they were surreptitiously plied with a wide range of substances, including LSD, and monitored behind one-way glass. Several significant operational techniques were developed in this theater, including extensive research into sexual blackmail, surveillance technology, and the possible use of mind-altering drugs in field operations. Now, this is very relevant to what they have been doing to me. Anyway, in 1957, with funding from a CIA-front organization, Donald Ewan Cameron of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, began MKUltra Subproject 68. His experiments were designed to first depattern individuals, erasing their minds and memories, reducing them to the mental level of an infant, and then to rebuild their personality in a manner of his choosing. To achieve this, Cameron placed patients under his care into drug-induced comas for up to 88 days and applied numerous high-voltage electric shocks to them over the course of weeks or months. Often administering up to 360 shocks per person, he would then perform what he called psychic driving experiments on the subjects, where he would repetitively play recorded statements such as, "You are a good wife and mother, and people enjoy your company," through speakers he had implanted into blacked-out football helmets that he bound to the heads of the subjects for sensory deprivation purposes. For weeks at a time, in one case, Cameron forced a person to listen to a message nonstop for 101 days. Using CIA funding, Cameron converted the horse stables behind Allen Memorial into elaborate isolation and sensory deprivation chamber where he kept patients locked in for weeks at a time. Cameron also induced insulin comas in his subjects by giving them large injections of insulin twice a day for up to 2 months at a time. Several of the children who Cameron experimented on were sexually abused in at least one case by several men. One of the children was filmed numerous times performing sexual acts with high-ranking federal government officials. In a scheme set up by Cameron and other MKUltra researchers to blackmail the officials to ensure further funding for the experiments. You can't make that shit up. That is disgusting. That is appalling. And, the government's a bunch of pedophiles who are being blackmailed by secret society scum so they could further their secret society activities. The frequent screams of the patients that echoed through the hospital did not deter Cameron or most of his associates in their attempts to depattern their subjects completely. John D. Marks, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, Chapter 8. The CIA leadership had serious concerns about these activities, as evidenced in a 1957 Inspector General report, which stated, "Precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American people in general. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles." 1957 CIA Inspector General report. In 1963, CIA had synthesized many of the findings from its psychological research into what became known as KUBAR, Counterintelligence Interrogation Handbook, which cited the MKUltra studies and other secret programs as the scientific basis for their interrogation methods. Cameron regularly traveled around the U.S., teaching military personnel about his techniques, hooding of prisoners for sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, humiliation, etc., and how they could use these in interrogations. Latin American psychological techniques at places such as the School of the Americas in the 21st century. Many of these torture techniques developed in the MKUltra studies and other programs are being used at U.S. military and CIA prisons such as Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. In the aftermath of the congressional hearings, major news media mainly focused on sensationalistic stories related to LSD, mind control, and brainwashing, and rarely used the word torture. This suggested that CIA researchers were, as one author put it, a bunch of bumbling sci-fi buffoons, rather than a rational group of men who had run torture laboratories and medical experiments in major U.S. universities. They had arranged for torture, rape, and psychological abuse of adults and young children, driving many of them permanently insane. MKUltra activities continued until 1973 when CIA Director Richard Helms, fearing that it would be exposed to the public, ordered the project terminated and all of the files destroyed. But a clerical error had sent many of the documents to the wrong office. So when CIA workers were destroying the files, some of them remained. They were later released under a Freedom of Information Act request by investigative journalist John Marks. Many people in the American public were outraged when they learned of the experiments, and several congressional investigations took place, including the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission. On April 26, 1976, the Church Committee of the United States issued a final report of the Select Committee to the study governmental operation with respect to intelligence activities. Well, as far as the Rockefeller Commission, I'm going to look into whether it's Nelson Rockefeller or the Rockefeller family. I'm pretty sure it might be Nelson. Anyway, on April 26, 1976, the Church Committee of the United States Senate issued a final report of the Select Committee to study governmental operation with respect to intelligence activities. In Book 1, Chapter 17, page 389, this report states, LSD was one of the materials tested in the MKUltra program. The final phase of LSD testing involved surreptitious administration to unwitting volunteer subjects in normal life settings by undercover officers of the Bureau of Narcotics acting for the CIA. A special procedure designated MK Delta was established to govern the use of MKUltra materials abroad. Such materials were used on a number of occasions. Because MKUltra records were destroyed, it is impossible to reconstruct the operational use of MKUltra materials by the CIA overseas. It has been determined that the use of these materials abroad began in 1953 and possibly as early as 1950. Drugs were used primarily as an aid to interrogations, but MKUltra, MK Delta materials were also used for harassment, discrediting, or disabling purposes. On record, government harassment on record. Experiments on patients with schizophrenia. Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University performed experiments on 42 patients with schizophrenia and prisoners in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. These experiments were funded by the U.S. Army. In the studies, he dosed them with LSD and Cap9 and implanted electrodes in the septal area of the brain to stimulate it and take EEG readings. Torture experiments. From 1964 to 1968, the U.S. Army paid $386 and $486 to professors Albert Kligman and Herbert W. Copeland to perform experiments with mind-altering drugs on 320 inmates of Holmesburg Prison. The goal of the study was to determine the minimum effective dosage of each drug. Try to wrap this up in 15 minutes. I'm going to read quickly. Need to disable 50% of any given population. Kligman and Copeland initially claimed that they were unaware of any long-term health effects the drugs could have on prisoners. However, documents later revealed that this was not the case. Medical professionals gathered and collected data on the CIA's use of torture techniques on detainees during the 21st century's war on terror in order to refine those techniques and to provide legal cover for the torture as well as to help justify and shape future procedures and policies, quote unquote, according to a 2010 report by Physicians for Human Rights. The report stated that research and medical experimentation on detainees was used to measure the effects of large volume waterboarding and adjust the procedure according to the results. As a result of the waterboarding experiments, doctors recommended adding saline to the water to prevent putting detainees in a coma or killing them through over-ingestion of large amounts of plain water. Sleep deprivation tests were performed on over a dozen prisoners in 48, 96, and 180-hour increments. Doctors also collected data intended to help them judge the emotional and physical effects of the techniques as to calibrate the level of pain experienced by detainees during interrogation, and to determine if using certain types of techniques would increase the subject's susceptibility to severe pain. In 2010, the CIA denied the allegations, claiming they never performed any experiments and saying the report is just wrong. However, the U.S. government never investigated these claims. The psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen ran a company that was paid $81 million by the CIA that, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture, developed the enhanced interrogation techniques used. In November 2014, the American Psychological Association announced that they would hire a lawyer to investigate claims that they were complicit in the development of enhanced interrogation techniques that constituted torture. In August 2010, the U.S. weapons manufacturer Raytheon announced that it had partnered with a jail in Castaic, California, in order to use prisoners as test subjects for its active denial system that fires an invisible heat beam capable of causing unbearable pain. Oh, this is fucking key right here. The device, dubbed Pain Ray by its critics, was rejected for fielding in Iraq due to Pentagon fears that it would be used as an instrument of torture. This verifies TI claims and makes psychiatrists look like the bitches they are. Academic research in 1939 at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport, Iowa, 22 children were the subjects of the so-called monster experiment. This experiment attempted to use psychological abuse to induce stuttering in children who spoke normally. Oh, this is key. The experiment was designed by Dr. Wendell Johnson, one of the nation's most prominent speech pathologists, for the purpose of testing one of his theories on the cause of stuttering. In 1961, in response to the Nuremberg trials, the Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram performed his obedience to authority study, also known as the Milgram experiment, in order to determine if it was possible that the Nazi genocide could have resulted from millions of people who were just following orders. The Milgram experiment raised questions about the ethics of scientific experimentation because of the extreme emotional stress suffered by the participants, who were told as part of the experiment to apply electroshock to the test subjects. In 1971, Stanford University psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment, in which 24 male students were randomly assigned roles of prisoners and guards in a mock prison situated in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The participants adapted to the roles beyond Zimbardo's expectations, with guards exhibiting authoritarian status and psychologically abusing the prisoners, who were passive in their acceptance of the abuse. The experiment was largely controversial, with criticisms aimed toward the lack of scientific principles and a control group, and for ethical concerns regarding Zimbardo's lack of intervention in the prisoners' abuse. At Harvard University in the late 1940s, researchers began performing experiments in which they tested diethylstilbestrol, a synthetic estrogen, on pregnant women at the lying-in hospital of the University of Chicago. The women experienced an abnormally high number of miscarriages in babies with low birth rate. None of the women were told that they were being experimented on. So estrogen in the food might also not only just be to make men impotent, but to reduce the birth rate in women. Anyway, in 1962, researchers at the Laurel Children's Center in Maryland tested experimental acne medications on children. They continued their tests even after half of the children developed severe liver damage from the medications. In 2004, University of Minnesota research participant Dan Markingson committed suicide while enrolled in an industry-sponsored pharmaceutical trial comparing the FDA-approved atypical antipsychotic Seroquel, Zyprexa, and Risperidone. Writing on the circumstances surrounding Markingson's death in the study, which was designed and funded by Seroquel manufacturer AstraZeneca, University of Minnesota professor of bioethics Carl Elliott noted that Markinson was enrolled in the study against the wishes of his mother, Mary Weiss, and that he was forced to choose between enrolling in the study or being involuntarily committed to a state mental institution. This is typical of psychiatry, extremely typical. I've seen it firsthand. Further investigation revealed financial ties to AstraZeneca by Markinson's psychiatrist Dr. Stephen C. Olson, oversights and biases in AstraZeneca's trial design, and the inadequacy of the University Institutional Review Board protections for research subjects. 2005 FDA investigation cleared the university. Nonetheless, controversy around the case has continued. Mother Jones resulted in a group of university faculty members sending a public letter to the University Board of Regents urging an external investigation into Markinson's death. Other experiments. The 1846 journals of Walter F. Jones of Petersburg, Virginia, described how he poured boiling water onto the backs of naked slaves afflicted with typhoid pneumonia at 4-hour intervals because he thought that this might cure the disease by stimulating the capillaries. From early 1940 until 1953, Loretta Bender, a highly respected pediatric neuropsychiatrist who practiced at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, performed electroshock experiments on at least 100 children. The children's ages ranged from 3 to 12 years. Some reports indicate that she may have performed such experiments on more than 200. From 1942 to 1956, electroconvulsive treatment was used on more than 500 children at Bellevue Hospital, including Bender's experiments from 1956 to 1969. ECT was used at Creedmoor State Hospital Children's Service. Publicly, Bender claimed that the results of the therapy were positive, but in private memos, she expressed frustration over mental health issues caused by the treatments. Bender would sometimes shock children with schizophrenia, some less than 3 years old, twice per day for 20 consecutive days. Several of the children became violent and suicidal as a result of the treatments. In 1942, the Harvard University biochemist Edward Kahn injected 64 Massachusetts prisoners with cow blood as a part of an experiment sponsored by the U.S. Navy. In 1950, researchers at the Cleveland City Hospital ran experiments to study changes in cerebral blood flow. They injected people with spinal anesthesia and inserted needles into their jugular veins and brachial arterioles to extract large quantities of blood, and after massive blood loss, which caused paralysis and fainting, measured their blood pressure. The experiment was offered to perform multiple times on the same subject. In a series of studies which were published in the medical journal Pediatrics, researchers from the University of California Department of Pediatrics performed experiments on 113 newborns ranging in age from 1 hour to 3 days, in which they studied changes in blood pressure and blood flow. In one of the studies, researchers inserted a catheter through the baby's umbilical arteries and into their aortas, and then submerged their feet in ice water. In another of the studies, they strapped 50 newborn babies to a circumcision board and turned them upside down so that all the blood rushed into their heads. Fucking just complete garbage, complete filth. The San Antonio Contraceptive Study was a clinical research study published in 1971 about the side effects of oral contraceptives. Women coming to a clinic in San Antonio to prevent pregnancies were not told that they were participating in a research study or receiving placebos. 10 of the women became pregnant while on placebos. During the decade of 2000 to 2010, artificial blood was transfused into research subjects across the United States without their consent by Northfield Labs. Later studies showed that artificial blood caused a significant increase in the risk of heart attacks and death. Legal, academic, and professional policy. Human subject research legislation in the United States during the Nuremberg medical trials, several of the Nazi doctors and scientists who were being tried for their human experiments cited past unethical studies performed in the United States in their defense, namely the Chicago malaria experiments conducted by Dr. Joseph Goldberger. Sounds like a Jewish name, like Hyman. Subsequent investigation led to a report by Andrew Conway Ivy, who testified that the research was an example of human experimentations which were ideal because of their conformity with the highest ethical standards of human experimentation. The trials contributed to the formation of the Nuremberg Code in an effort to prevent such abuses. A secret AAC document dated April 17, 1947, titled Medical Experiments in Humans, stated, "It is desired that no document be released which refers to experiments with humans that might have an adverse reaction on public opinion or results in legal suits. Documents covering such fieldwork should be classified secret." That's quote unquote. At the same time, the Public Health Service was instructed to tell citizens downwind from bomb tests that the increases in cancers were due to neurosis, and that women with radiation sickness, hair loss, and burned skin were suffering from housewife syndrome. In 1964, the World Medical Association passed the Declaration of Helsinki, a set of ethical principles for the medical community regarding human experimentation. Now notice the housewife syndrome, right? This is to feed into feminism. There's feminists doing experiments on women and also trying to feed in their agenda, secretly by saying, oh, this is what happens when you're a housewife. Anyway, in 1966, the United States National Institute of Health, NIH, Office for Protection of Research Subjects, OPRR, was created. It issued its policies for the protection of human subjects, which recommended establishing independent review bodies to oversee experiments. These were later called institutional review boards. In 1969, Kentucky Court of Appeals Judge Samuel Steinfeld dissented in Strunk versus Strunk, 445 SW2D 145. He made the first judicial suggestion that the Nuremberg Code should be applied to American jurisprudence. some Jews trying to go down history as the good guys. In 1974, well, at least his name sounds Jewish. In 1974, the National Research Act established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. It mandated that the Public Health Service come up with regulations to protect the rights of human research subjects. Project MKUltra was first brought to wide public attention in 1975 by the U.S. Congress through the investigations by the Church Committee and by a presidential commission known as the Rockefeller Commission. In 1975, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, DHEW, created regulations which included the recommendations laid out in the NIH's 1966 Policies for the Protection of Human Subjects, Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations known as the Common Rule. Requires the appointment and use of institutional review boards in experiments using human subjects. On April 18, 1979, prompted by an investigative journalist's public disclosure of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, later renamed to Health and Human Services, released a report entitled Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research, written by Dan Harms. It laid out many modern guidelines for ethical medical research. These are being ignored by the gangstalkers, of course. In 1987, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the United States versus Stanley, 483 U.S. 669, that a U.S. serviceman who was given LSD without his consent as part of military experiments could not sue the U.S. Army for damages, dissenting their verdict in U.S. versus Stanley. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor stated, "No judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi scientists who have experimented with human subjects during the Second World War, and the standards that the Nuremberg military tribunals developed to judge the behavior of the defendants stated that the voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is to see that the victims are compensated as best as they can be by the perpetrators." Notice the hypocrisy in America, who are worse than Nazis. I mean, if the Americans are worse than the Nazis, of course they're more, ISIS is more righteous than America. On January 15, 1994, President Bill Clinton formed the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRE. This committee was created to investigate and report the use of human beings as test subjects in experiments involving the effects of ionizing radiation in federally funded research. The committee attempted to determine the cause of the experiments and reasons that the proper oversight did not exist. It made several recommendations to help prevent future occurrences of similar events. As of 2007, not a single U.S. government researcher has been prosecuted for human experimentation. The preponderance of the victims of U.S. government experiments have not received compensation or, in many cases, acknowledgement of what was done to them.